From the 12th century onward, medieval European cities expanded faster than their ability to manage waste, water, and population density. This was not a failure of intelligence or governance. It was a structural consequence of how cities were built, defended, and economically organized. Archaeological surveys of medieval urban layers in London, Paris, York, Bruges, and Cologne consistently show thick accumulations of refuse within inhabited areas, sometimes spanning multiple centuries without systematic removal. These layers are not evidence of temporary breakdown. They represent normal urban operation. Medieval cities were enclosed by defensive walls that restricted horizontal growth. As populations increased, cities became vertically and spatially compressed. Houses were built taller, streets narrower, and open space scarce. Urban density increased without corresponding changes in infrastructure. There were no underground sewage systems capable of handling waste at scale. Surface drainage relied on open gutters that followed the slope of streets, carrying refuse only when rainfall was sufficient. In dry periods, waste remained in place. Municipal records confirm awareness of the problem. City councils repeatedly issued ordinances banning the dumping of waste into streets and waterways. London's civic records from the 13th and 14th centuries contain dozens of such regulations. Their repetition is significant. Laws that work do not need to be restated. These did. Enforcement was inconsistent, penalties were limited, and alternative disposal methods were largely absent. Urban life continued because it had no viable substitute. Economic activity intensified contamination. Medieval cities concentrated trades essential to survival and commerce. Markets operated daily, drawing people, animals, and goods into confined spaces. Livestock were driven through city streets to central markets. Slaughter often occurred near points of sale to preserve freshness. Blood, offal, and waste entered public spaces as part of routine commerce. Archaeological remains of butchered animal bones are found in large quantities in urban deposits, mixed directly with household refuse. Industries such as tanning, dyeing, brewing, and metalworking were embedded within residential areas. Tanneries used urine, lime, and animal fats to process hides. Dyers discharged chemical residues from plant and mineral sources into nearby watercourses. These activities produced strong odors and visible pollution. Yet they remained in place because proximity reduced transport costs and supported guild economies. Attempts to relocate such trades were rare and often resisted. Daily movement through the city occurred within this environment. Streets functioned simultaneously as transit routes, marketplaces, drainage channels, and waste disposal zones. There was no functional separation between clean and contaminated space. Public squares hosted markets, festivals, and religious ceremonies, while also accumulating refuse. The same locations served multiple roles without cleansing in between. Disease circulated easily in these conditions, but it was not treated as an interruption of daily life. Endemic illnesses, such as dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis, and recurring fevers were common features of urban existence. There was no systematic isolation of the sick. Inns, workshops, churches, and markets remained open. People continued to gather because urban survival depended on participation. Avoidance was not an option. The city absorbed illness as part of its operating environment. Burial grounds within or near city centers filled rapidly. Graves were reused, and human remains accumulated over time. Church records show frequent burials during non-epidemic periods, indicating persistent mortality rather than rare catastrophe. Bells rang often enough to lose their association with emergency. Major outbreaks revealed, rather than created, urban vulnerability. When the Black Death reached Europe in the late 1340s, cities suffered disproportionately. High population density, continuous trade routes, and constant interpersonal contact accelerated transmission. Mortality rates were catastrophic, but the mechanisms were already in place. After population loss, cities rebuilt on the same spatial patterns. Narrow streets, mixed land use, and embedded industries persisted. This continuity highlights a critical point. Filth and disease were not viewed as failures of medieval cities. They were accepted costs of concentration. Cities offered employment, protection, access to markets, and social advancement. Rural life offered exposure to famine, isolation, and insecurity. For many, urban risk was preferable. The most disturbing aspect of medieval urban life is not the presence of contamination, but its integration. Filth was not hidden at the margins. Disease was not treated as an external threat. Both were woven into the daily routines of work, worship, and trade. Medieval cities did not collapse under these conditions. They functioned, expanded, and defined European civilization while operating inside environments saturated with waste and illness. To understand why disease became unavoidable in this environment, it is necessary to examine how daily urban life forced people into constant contact. Disease in medieval cities spread not because of chaos, but because urban life was organized around constant human convergence. Cities functioned as nodes where movement never stopped. Every essential activity required proximity, repetition, and circulation, creating stable transmission pathways that operated continuously, not episodically. Markets formed the core of these pathways. In most medieval cities, markets were held daily or several times a week and were legally protected institutions. Closing a market was considered an economic emergency. As a result, trade continued regardless of illness. Rural producers entered the city with animals, grain, and produce. Urban residents gathered to buy, sell, and exchange. The same physical space processed livestock, food, money, and people in rapid succession. Archaeological layers beneath medieval market squares show dense concentrations of animal bone, organic waste, and household refuse, indicating uninterrupted use over centuries. These spaces did not reset. They accumulated. Inns and taverns extended transmission beyond the city itself. Medieval Europe was highly mobile. Merchants, pilgrims, messengers, soldiers, and laborers moved constantly between urban centers. Inns concentrated strangers from multiple regions into shared rooms, often with shared bedding and minimal cleaning between occupants. Records from major trade routes show inns clustered near city gates, bridges, and ports, ensuring that travelers passed directly into the urban core. Disease entered cities not as an invasion, but as part of routine traffic. Religious life intensified contact rather than limiting it. Feast days, saints' festivals, funerals, and processions brought large crowds together in confined spaces. Participation was not optional. Absence carried social and spiritual consequences. Even during periods of known illness, religious gatherings continued. Chroniclers describe cities interpreting outbreaks as divine judgment, reinforcing communal rituals rather than discouraging them. Mass gatherings created temporary spikes in contact that layered onto already dense daily interaction. Work organized exposure at a local level. Guild systems grouped artisans by trade within specific districts. Workshops were small, crowded, and continuous. Apprentices lived with masters. Journeymen moved between workshops. Production depended on close cooperation. Illness did not remove individuals from these spaces. Work continued because wages and food depended on it. Urban productivity required sustained physical presence. Households multiplied risk internally. Medieval homes often contained extended families, servants, lodgers, and sometimes animals. Space was limited. Meals were shared. Sleeping arrangements overlapped. When illness entered a household, it rarely remained isolated. Domestic routines continued because survival demanded them. There was no mechanism for separation that did not threaten subsistence. Movement between cities ensured regional synchronization of disease. Medieval Europe possessed dense trade networks linking ports, river systems, and inland markets. Grain shipments, wool trade, and merchant caravans moved with seasonal regularity. Historical records show outbreaks appearing along these routes in predictable sequences. Cities connected by commerce experienced disease in succession, not isolation. Urban networks acted as amplifiers. Authorities were not unaware of these patterns, but response options were limited. Some cities attempted quarantines during major outbreaks, particularly in the later medieval period. These measures were inconsistent and often short-lived. Economic pressure undermined enforcement. Merchants resisted restrictions. Travelers evaded controls. City governments lacked the administrative capacity to sustain prolonged isolation. Preventive strategies conflicted with economic survival. The Black Death illustrates the efficiency of these systems. It did not strike at random. It followed shipping lanes, trade roads, and market towns. Cities with higher connectivity suffered earlier and more intensely. Mortality varied, but the mechanism was consistent. Density and movement determined impact. Yet even after catastrophic loss, cities resumed the same patterns. Markets reopened. Trade resumed. Urban life reconstructed itself around the same converging activities. This persistence reveals the underlying logic of medieval urban life. Disease was not viewed as a reason to dismantle daily routines. It was interpreted as an intermittent consequence of necessary interaction. Avoidance meant exclusion from economic and social life. Participation meant risk. Most people chose participation because the city offered access to food, work, protection, and opportunity unavailable elsewhere. The most unsettling reality is not that medieval cities failed to control disease. It is that they were remarkably effective at sustaining the very systems that spread it. Trade, worship, labor, and mobility functioned with precision. Disease traveled those same channels with equal reliability. Urban civilization advanced by accepting this duality. Medieval cities did not collapse because of disease. They adapted around it. Illness became an expected cost of concentration rather than a signal to change structure. The city survived by maintaining its networks, even when those networks carried death alongside prosperity. Given these conditions, the real question is not why cities were dangerous, but why people continued to choose them. Despite the visible presence of filth and disease, medieval cities continued to attract people in growing numbers. This was not ignorance. Urban danger was widely recognized. Chronicles, sermons, and municipal records repeatedly describe unhealthy conditions and recurring outbreaks. Yet migration into cities did not slow. In many regions, it accelerated. The reason lies in the structural advantages cities offered over rural life, advantages strong enough to outweigh constant risk. Cities concentrated opportunity. Rural populations lived at the edge of subsistence, dependent on harvests, weather, and the demands of landowners. Famine, crop failure, and isolation could be fatal. Cities offered alternatives. Wage labor, even poorly paid, provided access to food and shelter independent of agricultural cycles. Markets ensured supply diversity. When one source failed, another might compensate. Urban economies created resilience through multiplicity, not safety. Cities also concentrated protection. Defensive walls did more than repel external threats. They symbolized order, authority, and collective security. Banditry, feuding, and localized violence were persistent dangers in the countryside. Inside city walls, law enforcement, however imperfect, existed. Guilds, councils, and courts offered mechanisms for dispute resolution unavailable to many rural communities. For those fleeing instability, urban risk felt manageable compared to rural vulnerability. Social mobility further pulled people inward. Cities disrupted rigid hierarchies. Apprenticeship systems allowed individuals to enter trades regardless of birth. Successful artisans could gain status, wealth, and political influence through guild membership. Even marginal gains mattered. The possibility of advancement, however slim, outweighed the certainty of stagnation elsewhere. Filth and disease were known costs, but advancement was a powerful incentive. Religious and institutional presence reinforced urban gravity. Cathedrals, monasteries, hospitals, and universities clustered in cities. These institutions provided charity, education, and legitimacy. Hospitals did not cure disease as understood today, but they offered shelter, food, and care. Urban religious life provided meaning and community during crisis. Cities became centers not only of commerce, but of interpretation. Suffering was framed, explained, and ritualized rather than simply endured. Economic specialization locked cities into dominance. Urban centers controlled production and distribution networks. Crafts, finance, and long-distance trade concentrated within city walls. Rural producers depended on urban markets to sell surplus and obtain goods. This dependence flowed one way. Cities could survive rural disruption more easily than rural communities could survive urban exclusion. Power accumulated where exchange occurred. After catastrophic events, this logic became clearer rather than weaker. Following the Black Death, many cities lost large portions of their populations. Labor shortages increased wages. Opportunities expanded. Survivors found themselves in stronger bargaining positions. Urban life, despite devastation, became more attractive to many. Migration resumed. Cities rebuilt quickly because the structures that made them valuable remained intact. Importantly, cities did not significantly reform their daily practices in response to disease. Sanitation improvements were limited and uneven. Mixed land use persisted. Markets, workshops, and residences remained intertwined. This was not a failure to learn. It was a recognition that dismantling urban systems would destroy the very advantages that made cities viable. Medieval urban success rested on a calculated acceptance of risk. Cities optimized for exchange, control, and opportunity, not health. Disease did not negate these functions. It accompanied them. Urban societies developed cultural frameworks that normalized loss. Death became frequent enough to be expected. Burial rituals, memorial practices, and religious narratives absorbed mortality into civic life. This normalization allowed cities to endure conditions that would otherwise have been intolerable. People did not need cities to be safe. They needed them to be useful. The calculus was brutal but rational. A dangerous city offered more than a dangerous countryside. By the late medieval period, cities had reshaped Europe's political and economic landscape. States centralized around urban centers. Trade networks expanded. Institutions solidified. This transformation occurred not in spite of filth and disease, but alongside them. Urban civilization proved that complexity could thrive under conditions of constant risk. The most unsettling conclusion is that medieval cities succeeded because they accepted what modern societies seek to eliminate. Contamination, illness, and loss were not obstacles to progress. They were managed, absorbed, and incorporated into daily life. Cities did not promise safety. They promised survival with possibility. This is why medieval urban life persisted. Not because people failed to see the danger, but because the alternatives were worse. Filth and disease did not drive people away. They became the background against which opportunity, power, and civilization itself were built.